Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Hawk Blogger Mornings. I am Brian Nimhauser, coming to you a little bit late on this Seahawks Saturday and a little bit lonely. My good pal Jeff Simmons had work that ended up being a conflict late last night for today. So I scrambled around. Actually ended up using this morning to finish an article that I've been working on for a little bit this week during the bye week, where I went and looked at all the Seahawks teams that won at least 5 of their first 7 games since 2000. In fact, I looked at all of them, but I just wrote about the ones since 2000. And the goal was to try to figure out, like, can we trust this 5-2 start? Is this the start of something special? Is it just maybe like a lot of other seasons we've seen from a Seahawks team that started this way and then kind of flopped toward the end? The findings were pretty interesting, I gotta say. Now it's just what I found. I'm going to share it with you on this episode, but I'm really curious what you guys think. Once I present all of this to you, I'm sure you guys will have opinions as well. Make sure you leave comments, likes, all that good stuff. And you can head over to hawkblogger.com to read the full article. I've got a lot more detail in the article and get into a couple things there, but I will share at least some of the stats and then some of the things. Just to be a little bit of a walk down memory lane today, to be honest. So the longer you've been a Seahawks fan, the more I think you will appreciate this episode. And honestly, anyone that's been a Seahawks fan since the Super Bowl team, since the LOB era, I think is going to be pretty entertained by some of the comparisons and where this team stacks up and where it doesn't. So before I get into all that, I got some really, really nice reviews over on Apple Podcasts. Been asking you guys to leave reviews on Apple Podcasts, and I wanted to read a couple of them and just tell you, like, it honestly made my day. It really did, the way I started my day today. I got one from Juan Deanda, says, Hawk Blogger is the perfect mix of passion and insight. Brian Nimhauser is the best Seahawks analyst. I love this podcast, and I'm always looking forward to new episodes. Keep up the amazing work. Go Hawks from Colorado. Well, appreciate that. Got another one from Matt in Rochester, New York, who says the only Seahawks podcast that literally makes me run to the podcast app after work in hopes of some new Seahawks content. Listen to it on the drive to work, on the drive to the gym after work, and when I get home afterward. Always keeps me up to date and informed, entertaining, informative, and fun. Please keep it up. Just really, really, really appreciate it. One more I'll read here. This one is not from a named person, but just says, I'm a sicko. We all are for watching this show. I'm addicted to Seahawks content with all due respect to many talent creators and analysts out there, and I promised I've listened to them all. You do not need to look any further. Follow Brian plus the Seahawks Collective and Rob Staten, Mike Ducar, because Hawk Blogger is complete. It's routine, it's considered, it's quality, and it's all you're going to need. So make my day if you can. Leave some more 5-star reviews over on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, all those places. It really does help us grow the show. And it's a grind doing this, and I like it helps to hear from you folks when it's going well, especially. All right, so let's get into it. Let me first explain kind of my methodology for how I went about this. First things first, I went through and actually got the first 7 games of data from every Seahawks season that has existed. All 50 seasons, I've got the first 7 games of data. And I started looking through that and comparing where this team stacked up with some of the all-time, like whether it was the best, worst, whatever. And one of the things I found while doing that was that the Seahawks have given up 9 sacks. And initially I thought, and I have to correct this tweet I sent out, but initially I thought that was the fewest sacks the Seahawks had ever given up through 7 games. Turns out it's the second fewest. I think the 1983 team gave up 6 sacks through 7 games, but still, that's pretty crazy. If you had told me before this season began that the Seahawks would allow less than 10 sacks in their first 7 games and be the second best in that category in team history, I would not have believed you. And I don't know that many people would have. And I was pretty bullish on how much I thought the pass protection could improve with a lot of the things we've already talked about. But anyway, so I went through and I was looking through data in that regard, just to kind of see where this team stacks up. I didn't put a lot of that in the article, to be honest. I then, because what I did next is I filtered down to which of the teams started with at least 5 wins in their first 7 games. And you guys know me, I tend to go super deep on the data and the analytics. And I had like a pretty in-depth picture of how I wanted to compare these teams. And then I started putting it, together. And I was like, this is going to take a long time. And I don't know that anyone would really care about the amount of detail that I would care about. So let me just simplify. So what I did is I picked a few, I think, highly predictive, highly valuable metrics to look at. The ones I picked are points scored, points allowed. That is kind of how the game's played. So you want to do both those well. Point differential, which again, the longer you go into the season, the more efficacy that has. Yards per play on offense and yards per play on defense. This is an old, Vegas standby in terms of determining quality of team. And then also the difference between your yards per play on offense and yards per play on defense. So if you gain 6 yards per play and you allow 5, then the difference is 1 yard per play, right? So that's kind of an effective way to look at, in general, are you gaining yardage against your opponent on both sides of the ball? And then I went to DVOA as kind of a catch-all, because one of the values of DVOA is it bakes in things like drive success rate and points per drive, and it bakes in things like EPA and all of that kind of stuff goes into that. Plus, it's opponent adjusted. That's what the OA stands for. And it's a little bit era adjusted because you're really measuring against other teams going through that particular season. So I went and grabbed overall DVOA, offensive DVOA, defensive DVOA, and special teams DVOA from after the 7th game of every season that I was picking from. Okay. So let me just clarify again. I got the DVOA specifically at this point. So we'll be comparing apples to apples. What was the DVOA for the teams I'm comparing to and the Seahawks? And both of them will have played 7 games at that point. All right. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. I can explain again if there's more questions. But yeah, it was honestly really surprising what I found. I didn't know what I was going to find. I had some guesses, but it was even surprising which were the teams that actually won 5 games and how they fared. And it was a total trip down memory lane to go through and find these teams. So without further ado, let's go through it. I'm going to start with the 2023 Seahawks. Now, this is the last team to go have 5 wins within their first 7 games for the Seahawks. All right. So I'm going to make this as big as I can because I'm not going to read the text, but I am going to try to get that table so you guys can see it. All right. So the 2023 Seahawks did start 5-2. They finished 9-8, 3rd place in the NFC West. They did not make the playoffs. When you look at some of the comparisons of these two teams, the Seahawks are scoring much more than they were at that point. 27.6 points per game now. That team was 24 points per game. Defensively is actually pretty close. 19.4 points a game now. It was 19.7 points then. Now, again, this is after 7 games. This is not the full season. This is an apples to apples where they were after 7 games. It's not apples to apples in terms of playing the same teams and the same records and the same home games, all that. Sure. But it's at the same point in the season. All right. So point differential. That team had a plus 30 point differential. The Seahawks of this year have plus 57. Okay. We'll talk about how good that stacks up as we go through this. From a yards per play perspective, this Seahawks team is gaining 6 yards per play on offense. That one was 5.6. This team is allowing 4.7. That one was actually allowing 4.8 at this point in the season, which is pretty shocking to me because I thought about that defense as a pretty crappy defense. So that works out to what ends up being a 1.4 yards per play differential. And if you're doing the math and you say 6.0 minus 4.7 is 1.3, how do you get to 1.4? Well, Google Sheets rounds off, and you'll see a little bit later when we get to the next decimal point that it is actually rounding up to 1.4. All right. That team was 0.8. So less than a yard per play difference than their opponent. This one is 1.4. From a DVOA perspective, the Seahawks are the number one DVOA team in the NFL. You're going to see that's pretty rare, actually, for the Seahawks. Even the best of the best Seahawks teams have not necessarily been number one at this point in the season. The 2023 was number 10 as a comparison. This Seahawks offense is number 7 from a DVOA perspective. That one was 9. This Seahawks defense is 2. That one was 15. That's where that's a little bit more what I remember of that defense. Like, it was mid at best. And then special teams, this Seahawks team is number 1 in DVOA. That one was 11th. And just to remind you about that 2013 season, this was Pete Carroll's last year. And it started with a brutal game against the Rams, where the Seahawks were actually ahead at halftime. And then both Charles Cross and Abe Lucas went out with injury. And they ended up losing. They didn't score a single point in the second half. They got outscored 23-0. It was a 30-13 season opening loss at home. It was brutal. And somehow Geno Smith and that offense and that team went into Detroit the next week against the Lions, a Lions team that had beaten the Chiefs on the road, and they beat the Lions in their home opener with like Stone Forsythe blocking Aiden Hutchinson. It was a very shocking win. And, as that went on, you had then you had Andy Dalton come in for the Panthers in that game, and you barely managed to beat Andy Dalton. And then from there, that was a 37-27 win. And then you go in, and Devin Witherspoon has his kind of coming out game against the Giants. You win that game 24-7. Devin Witherspoon has what is still his only interception as a Seahawk. It was a pick 6 in that game. You win 24-3, I should say. So the Seahawks went to 3-1 that season. They had won 3 straight after dropping that game to the Rams, after having serious injuries to Charles Cross and Abe Lucas. Still were out at this point. They got a very early bye week, and they had scored 37 points in 2 of their 4 games. They were scoring pretty well. If it wasn't for the 13 points in the first game, then they would have been even better. But then they went to Cincinnati, and that's where the offensive line stuff really started to rear its head. Jake Curhan was starting at right tackle against the Bengals and against Sam. It's Trey Hendrickson and Sam's whatever his other name is. I can pull it up real quick. I'm kind of curious. Sam Hubbard. Yes, Sam Hubbard tortured the Seahawks, and great Jake Curran in that game. They dropped that one. But then the Seahawks won a couple, one against the Cardinals at home, but that was against Josh Dobbs. Okay. Josh Dobbs was the quarterback of that Cardinals team. And then they beat the Cleveland Browns at home with PJ Walker at the quarterback. By the way, that was the same Cleveland Browns team that had beaten the 49ers earlier that year. So there's a lot of weird stuff going on, but they were 5-2. But there's a lot of questions about the quality of that team. Then what happened? Mike McDonald happened. The Seahawks went in. They actually traded for Leonard Williams before that Ravens game. That was his first game as a Seahawk. And oh my gosh, I feel so bad. I'm so glad that he's had better days with Seattle. Since then, the Seahawks got dismantled 37-3 in that game. Was never competitive. And that really exposed a lot of flaws with this team. The defense gave up 515 yards. It wasn't just about Mike McDonald stopping the offense, which only had 151 yards on the day. It was just an absolute, you are not good enough, you do not belong type of moment. Now, from there on, the Seahawks would lose 4 of their next 5, including both games against the 49ers. That was the 49ers team that went to the Super Bowl. They did manage to beat the Eagles like they always seem to be able to do. They beat a weak Titans team on the road, took a late game-winning score to do so. And then that Steelers game, which we've talked a bunch about, where they just got ran off their own home field by Mason Rudolph and that team, and lost their chance at the playoffs. So that team, for me, it was the end. It was the end for Pete Carroll. It was the end for that defense. They had some good young talent. Devin Witherspoon was on that team. Tariq Woolen was on that team. There's a number of players that were good players on that team. Charles Cross and Abe Lucas were part of that roster, even if though they were injured for most of that year. But there's just not a lot of comparisons between that group and this one. And a lot of their early wins were kind of phantom wins against PJ Walker and against Andy Dalton at home and against Josh Dobbs and stuff like that. So while they did start off 5-2, there was all sorts of reasons to be questioning whether or not that was going to last. And of course it didn't. So that's that team. And the other thing I'll point out here is that they held, from a rushing defense perspective, 3 of their first 5 opponents, they held under 100 yards, but just 2 of their final 12 failed to break the century mark. And 9 out of 12 rushed for 135 yards. The last 2 opponents rushed for over 200 yards on the ground. So that was just a awful, unable to hold up defense. And they had started with a pretty good pass rush, which is actually, they had the same amount of sacks through 7 games, 23, as the Seahawks, 3.3 per game. That dipped down to 2.1 over the final part of the season, 27th in the NFL. So they couldn't stop the run. They couldn't rush the passer. And that defense couldn't stop anything. So not a lot of comparison between those 2 teams, but let's look at this next comparison. The next one before that was the 2020 Seahawks. And this is interesting because they started 6-1, which ties for the best 7-game start in franchise history. They did go on to finish 12-4. That was the last time the Seahawks won the division. They did make the playoffs, obviously, but they lost in the first round of the wild card to the Rams. Jared Goff played that game but got injured. John Walford came in. Russ threw a pick 6 in that game. He was awful in that game. I think he was like 11 for 27. I've got it somewhere in the article, with, I think, a couple of interceptions. And it was just rough. But this was a fascinating one to just kind of remember, honestly. I'd flushed some of this. This was the let Russ cook year. They were absolutely cooking to start this season. They, with Brian Schottenheimer as the OC, with Russell Wilson getting this was his team. It was built around him. They averaged 34.3 points per game in the first 7. 34.3. They, like, the next closest team to them in franchise history through 7 games scored, I think, I want to say 46 fewer points. Let me look. I have it up here later. I'm going to see if I can find it real quick. It doesn't matter, but it was, 46 46 more points than the second place Seahawks team, which was 1987. So this team was red hot as far as offense goes. And they started with, let's see. So Russell Wilson threw 26 touchdowns through 7 games. 26 touchdowns through 7 games. That year, the next closest was Aaron Rodgers, had 20 touchdowns, which is still crazy through 7 games. And they scored 38 points in the first game, and they scored 30 points in each of their first 4 games, 30 plus points in each of their first 4 games. They only had 1 game under 30 points in their first 7. And in that one, they scored 27 points. So they were very much the number 1 DVOA offense at that point. And I kind of think about this Seahawks defense, which is the number 2 DVOA defense. Does it compare? Not really, honestly. Not really. Like, that was a historic pace that the Seahawks offense was on for the first 7 games. And they also, interestingly, you might not remember, they had a pretty darn good offensive line. They had Dwayne Brown at left tackle, Damian Lewis at left guard, Ethan Posick at center, and Brandon Shell at right tackle. Brandon Shell was one of the few right tackle, he's offensive lineman people forgot, but he was pretty good. And they had a weak spot at right guard, so there's a similarity there. Mike Upati kept getting injured, and so Jordan Simmons was there, and he just was not very good. So right guard was a little bit of an issue, but the only loss that they had in the first 7 games was on a Sunday night game against the Arizona Cardinals when they lost 37-34 to Kyler Murray. He had 3 passing touchdowns, 1 rushing touchdown, and 427 total yards between passing and rushing. Russell Wilson outclassed him in that regard. He had 474 yards with 3 passing touchdowns, and all of those went to Tyler Lockett for 200 yards receiving on 15 catches. But Russell Wilson, this was the start of what started to become an issue that season. He threw 3 picks. And you'll see by some of these other comparisons, this was in some ways a less efficient Russell Wilson from a turnover perspective. And the defense that, even after these first 7 games, I've talked to you all about the offense. But if you look at that defense, while they were scoring 34.3 points per game, which is amazing, they were allowing 28.4 points a game, which is awful. It was awful. And so the 199 points allowed through 7 games were the second most in franchise history through 7 games. Only the 1976 expansion team had allowed more, and they only allowed 5 more points. So this was almost equally as awful of a defense as it was amazing of an offense, which became kind of this irony of the Pete Carroll era, given that he was known for being a defensive head coach. Part of the problem with that defense was the pass rush was terrible. They had only 12 sacks through 7 games, 1.7 per game. So John Schneider traded for Carlos Dunlap from the Bengals. Maybe the Seahawks will find a way to trade for another Bengals pass rusher. Who knows? But that worked out reasonably well. He had 5 sacks the rest of the season. And remember, this was also Jamal Adams' maiden voyage with the team. He had 9.5 sacks this year. That led the team. But, there had never been a Seahawks offense that had averaged more yards per play. There had never been a Seahawks defense that had allowed more yards per play through 7 games. So it was just a real contrast. So then when Russell Wilson started to cool off, which did happen, and he started throwing more interceptions, Pete Carroll was like, we're going to not let Russ cook quite as much. We're going to simmer that a little more. The offense came back to earth, and the defense actually got quite a bit better, but it wasn't enough. It just wasn't enough. In fact, the defense in their final, so the defense held the final 8 opponents to 23 points or fewer. And so the team did win 6 of 9 games, even though the offense was having trouble scoring more than 23 points over the end of the season. So by the time they got to the playoffs, they lost that game. It was a home game. And there was just like a real lack of talent on defense, especially the defensive line. You're talking about guys like LJ Collier getting a bunch of snaps, Benson Mayowa getting a bunch of snaps, Damon Snacks Harrison, if you remember him, they tried to bring him in. Shaquem Griffin and his brother Shaquille were both playing. Trey Flowers, Ugo Amadi were both there. So, it just it's hard to compare because the weaknesses of that team were so much weaker than the weaknesses of this team. At the same time, for the first 7 games, that offense was hotter than any part of this Seahawks offense or defense. So I don't know that that's a good comp for what the 2025 team is. I do think that there has to be a little question of whether Sam Darnold and JSN can keep up the pace that they're on. And if they don't have a run game to rely on, what's that going to look like? Now, I think this defense is far more capable of keeping you afloat while you figure things out on offense than that defense was. I know, but there is still some question about whether there's going to be a little regression going on with that offense. All right, so let's go to the next one. Let's take a look at the 2019 Seahawks. And if you haven't given the show a like and click subscribe, now is a great time to do it. 2019 Seahawks, so the year before, in some ways was like the mirror image of the 2020 Seahawks. Instead of being this powerhouse passing offense, they were a powerhouse rushing offense. This was a year where Chris Carson rushed for 1,230 yards in just 15 games. And in fact, the team overall ran for 100 plus yards in 13 straight games and over 140 rushing yards 9 times. So this was a really, really good running team. But everyone got hurt. Chris Carson got hurt. Rashad Penny got hurt. CJ Procise got hurt. You went on and you had Travis Homer got hurt. They actually brought back Marshawn Lynch out of retirement and Robert Turbin to be part of this team and part of the playoff run. That's how crazy that season. This was one of the most bizarre seasons in Seahawks history. Josh Gordon, the wide receiver, was on this team. Jadeveon Clowney, this was his 1 year with the Seahawks. And he had that amazing game against the 49ers. He never could replicate it. And in fact, he got injured and missed a lot of the rest of the year after that game. You had Tedrick Thompson and Lano Hill and Bradley McDougald all trying to figure it out in the secondary. So they traded for Quandre Diggs. And he was there. But you had guys like Brandon Jackson getting snaps and Michael Kendricks as a linebacker. And ultimately, you still would have won the division if John Ursua would have ran his route into the end zone as he should have done when Russ passed to him. So just a weird year in general. The offense started off pretty strong. They scored 27 or more points in 5 of their first 6 games, and they were 5-1 before getting humbled by a different Ravens team. They lost 30-16. Now, I mentioned that Russell Wilson in 2020, the let Russ cook year, he had ended up with like 12 or 13 interceptions that year. This year, he had 31 touchdowns and just 5 interceptions. So he was not turning the ball over, but he was sacked a league-leading 48 times. 48. Think about that. The Seahawks have allowed 9 sacks through 7 games. Russ was sacked 48 times in 17 games that year. I think it was a 17-game season. I don't know. We'll find out. No, it was not a 17. It was a 16-game season. Either way, just crazy. So that was kind of the passing game was scoring and efficient. The running game was the engine. And that offense, for me, was actually much more balanced and had a much better chance of surviving if they hadn't had catastrophic injuries. The defense, not so great. Not so great. So Clowney was good in that one game. He only had 3 sacks, I think, that year. Sorry, I think I'm getting a call from a call from my car service place. I need to probably go pick up my car in a little bit. So, but they also were playing guys like Rasheem Green and Quentin Jefferson. Jaron Reed was on the team. Poona Ford and Al Woods were there doing good things. But they ranked 30th in rushing yards allowed, 28th in yards per attempt on running the ball. Pass defense ranked 27th in passing yards allowed. And the special teams wasn't great either. Jason Myers, this was one of his down years. He missed 5 field goals and 4 extra points. So while that offense was nice and balanced, I would say more balanced than this one, the 2025 for sure. The defense, that was their weak unit. Special teams was also weak. So 2 out of the 3 units were weak. If you just want to pick a side of the ball, that defense was way, way, way worse than the Seahawks offense. Way, way, way worse. The Seahawks offense is 7th in DVOA. That Seahawks defense in 2019 was 23rd, at least to this point in the year. So much, much different teams. I don't think they're a great comparison either. All right, before we get to the next comparison, let me check out some of these super chats and make sure I don't miss them. We got people giving away. Detail Oriented's back. Welcome back, Bobby. He's giving away 20 Hawk Blogger memberships, man. The generosity never stops with this guy. Super appreciate it. Make sure you have your gifting turned on your YouTube account so you can get one of these free memberships. Giuseppe Orlando has become a member. I love it, Giuseppe. Welcome, and I love that name. I want to say Giuseppe as many times as possible. And then Will Fries. I loved that 2019 team, but the defense was not good enough to cause damage in the playoffs, even if they beat the Niners to win the division. I think that's right. They were pretty beat up. Also, great chance to make sure you check out SimplySeattle.com. Use code HawkBlogger15. Get the best deal, 15% off your favorite Seattle sports gear that you haven't even bought yet. It's so good. They got great stuff. In fact, I'll turn this off for a second. This sweatshirt I'm wearing is Simply Seattle. I love it. I love this hoodie from them. It's awesome. So go to SimplySeattle.com. Use code HawkBlogger15 and download the Sleeper app. For a limited time, you can get $20 without even making a deposit and get all your fantasy football information, NBA stuff. And if you use promo code HAWKS, you'll get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. See Sleeper's terms of use for details. Currently operational in over 25 states. Check out Sleeper today. All right, let's get back to it. So we went through 2019, why that is not necessarily a great comp. So let's get to 2017. 2017. Now, I got to say, I'm going to warn you all. This one's going to get in your feels a little bit. Like this one, I had forgotten how tumultuous and how, what's the right word? Scarring, I think, this season was. So they started off 5-2. They finished 9-7. Finished second place in the NFC West, but they did not make the playoffs. So that's one of, I think, 2 teams in this list that did not make the playoffs. And let me tell you what happened. This was the transition year from LOB to post LOB. Cam Chancellor, Richard Sherman played their final games as a Seahawk. They both got injured down there in Arizona. Jeremy Lane, Byron Maxwell, Michael Bennett, Cliff Averill also played their last games as a Seahawk. Earl Thomas this was his last full season. He was gone early into the next year. Doug Baldwin Jr. was in his second to last year. He retired after the next season. Jimmy Graham, not that he's an LOB guy, but Jimmy Graham, this was his final year. Even John Ryan, the punter, was gone after this year. So you had all of these just iconic players coming to the end of their Seahawks career. And then you had some other weird things like Dwight Freeney was on that team, and Eddie Lacy was on that team, and Luke Jokel, and Ode Abushi, and Reese Odiamba was your starting left tackle for the beginning of that year. Matt Tobin got starts at tackle. It was going so poorly on the offensive line. This is really, I think, the season where everyone was like, what are you doing, John Schneider? What are you doing? So he, to his credit, was like, okay, this isn't working. He went and traded for Dwayne Brown during this year. But that wasn't the only trade. This was also the year where they had the 2017 draft, which was the most cataclysmic draft in Seahawks history. They traded down multiple times thinking they were clever, drafted Malik McDowell. They were very excited about that. He never played a snap for them because of an ATV accident off the field. That threw off their entire plans. They then kind of desperately traded for Sheldon Richardson before the season to try to, handle this absence of Malik McDowell. That 2017 draft class was mostly just terrible. Shaquille Griffin worked out, but you're talking about Tedrick Thompson and Lano Hill and just guy after guy after guy did not work out in that draft class. So you had all these guys leaving or ending their careers one way or another. And you had this influx of really bad young talent that just didn't belong. And so this team, while it started off strong, once some of those injuries hit, they could not sustain. This was still a defense-centric team. This was still a team that had Cam Chancellor and Richard Sherman and Jeremy Lane and Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill and these guys for at least part of the season. So that was still the identity of this team. But once they could not withstand the injuries, the defense started to crumble and the offense just wasn't ready. There was this little glimpse of the let Russ cook stuff starting where there was that shootout in Seattle against Deshaun Watson and the Texans that the Seahawks won 41-38. That actually got them to 5-2 after they'd started 2-2. But 2 games later was the game in Arizona where they won it, but they lost both Richard Sherman and Cam Chancellor. After that, it was rough. The offense late in the season had 2 games straight where they couldn't even get 150 total yards. I'm not talking rushing yards or passing yards, total yards. They didn't clear 150 yards. And then ultimately there was a 42-7 shellacking in Lumen Field by Sean McVay and the Rams in his first year. And that was the passing of the baton from Pete Carroll to Sean McVay. Unwillingly, that really just closed the door on that era of Seahawks football. Honestly, folks, we've been and the team's been rebuilding since 2017. Like, we have not recovered from 2017. So that was that team. And I would say, there were some guys that stepped up a little bit. Frank Clark had his 9-sack season and became a much better player. But it's just really hard to compare these two teams. That was a 2017 that was in transition and had a lot of old players that were entering their final years, and they had no young talent. I mean, even if you talk about some of the great older players on this team, like Leonard Williams, I'm not saying Byron Murphy is the next Leonard Williams, but you've got another young guy rising in exactly the same part of the field where Leonard Williams probably doesn't have 3 more years of this level of play, but you've got some young talent rising on that side of the ball. And there was nobody on either side of the ball for that Seahawks 2017 that was having a JSN-like year, becoming the best player at their position in the entire league. No, that did not exist on that 2017 squad. So the only thing that's a little similar is that the start of the season was like the script was kind of close. They both had frustrating losses to start the year. That team lost to Green Bay in Green Bay, 17-9. And they also had an early home blowout against a weak opponent where they won 46-18 against the Colts, just like the Seahawks beat the Saints. A lot of the games were close, but you can see by the DVOA where they were 16th overall, 18th on offense, 16th on defense, 13th on special teams through 7 games, that they were just a mediocre team. So that's where I just don't see them as a great comp for this 2025 team. I don't think there's a lesson to be learned about, beware, that could happen. So that gets us to a team that I think a lot of you will remember. And if you don't, then I don't know what Seahawks you've been watching. But the 2013 Seahawks also started with at least 5 wins. They're the only other team to start with 6 wins other than the 2020 squad. They went on to finish 13-3, first place in the NFC West, first place in the NFC overall. And yes, they won the Super Bowl. That was fun. Let's do that again. And look at the comparisons here. I expected it to be just across the board 2013 dominating 2025. It's not quite as clear cut as all of that. Now, the offenses are nearly identical. That team scored 27.3 points through the first 7. This team is 27.6, so pretty much a wash. Now, that team allowed 16.6 points. This team's allowing 19.4. Point differential. This is where the biggest difference from my perspective is. Point differential and defensive points allowed is the biggest difference. But that team had a plus 75 point differential by this point. This Seahawks team has 57. All right. But this Seahawks offense is doing better on yards per play, 6 versus 5.7. It's really 6.1, pretty close to 6.1. And then defensive yards per play, that team was just a little bit better, 4.5 versus 4.7. This team actually has the 2025 has a better yards per play differential than the 2013 team at this point. That was shocking to me. Also, that team, the 2013 team, was number 2 in DVOA at this point. Now, they would end the season number 1, but they were number 2 at this point. This Seahawks team is number 1. That team was 10th overall on offensive DVOA. That's lower than any of this team's DVOA ranks. So this team is 7th. It was better. Now, their defense was number 1 DVOA wise. This one was number 2. Their special teams was 10th. This Seahawks special teams is 1. So I'm just saying, it is not a whitewash. It is not what's the better word for it? It is not a clean sweep. That's a better phrase for the 2013 squad. Now, the only loss that squad had in its first 7 games was to Andrew Luck and the Colts by 6 points. And, they had already at this point, they'd beaten the 49ers at home 29-3. They beat the Jaguars 45-17. They did. Now, this is a fun one. You might not remember. As good as that defense was, the 2013 squad gave up 476 yards to the Texans. They were getting their butts spanked in the first half of that game down in Houston. So both teams played Houston. Guess who was coaching? Gary Kubiak was coaching. His offensive coordinator was Rick Dennison. His offensive line coach was John Benton. So kind of crazy, that tie between these two teams. And even as good as that Seahawks team was, there were still some stinkers. Like the first half against Houston, they fell behind 21-0 to an 0-7 Tampa Bay Bucks team in Seattle. They did come back and win 27-24. They also dealt with a ton of injuries. People forget Russell Okung missed 8 games. Breno Giacomini missed 8 games. Sidney Rice went on IR, was lost for the year. Percy Harvin, who they had traded for, missed almost the entire season. Max Unger missed 3 games. Brandon Browner missed 6 games. KJ Wright missed 4 games. So a lot of really good players missed a lot of games. And guess what? The pass protection was not great. But the overall play of that offensive line, for as much as people hate on Tom Cable, he found a way for that to work. Credit to those guys like Paul McQuiston stepping in. Max Unger, when he was available, was a massive game changer for that team. And then you had Marshawn Lynch, who just set the tone for the entire team. One of the other things that's interesting with that year is that the division was fierce. You had a 49ers team that was coming off a Super Bowl appearance and there was not a weakness on that squad. Carson Palmer was the quarterback of the Cardinals. They won 10 games that year, including one in Seattle in the last month of the season. But I think one of the things you found there is that all of those obstacles, all that adversity that they had to face just hardened that team. And so they had what I think has got to be one of the most difficult paths to a Super Bowl championship in the history of the NFL. They had to beat Drew Brees in the first game. And by the way, that was the offense that gave them the most trouble in the playoffs. That team put up 409 yards of offense in that first game, but they beat them. Then they had the 49ers game, and you know how tough that was. And then they played the Broncos and Peyton Manning, which was a record-setting offense. Neither the 49ers and Broncos offenses barely got more than 300 yards of offense, and we know how the Super Bowl ended up. So there's some pretty big differences. That team went into the year as clear Super Bowl contenders. That defense had already had a couple of years of being like number one in various categories. This is there's Hall of Fame level talent all across that roster, especially on defense. This is probably the best defense in the modern era. It will be in the conversation for the best defenses ever. I don't think that that's a fair comparison with this defense. This was kind of the peak in some ways of that team. And so even with all of that, when I set aside numbers and the roster, one of the things that separates that team from this one, to me, is the toughness on offense. Now, I'm not saying that this Seahawks team is not tough, but the run game that they were able to turn to that season and the way Marshawn Lynch, even if it wasn't blocked, was going to get 4 yards, that just made this team feared. No matter what the situation, no matter who you were going against, they were tougher than you on offense. They were tougher than you on defense. I think this Seahawks team has started to establish that on defense. I don't think you can say this Seahawks offense has yet established it's tougher than who they're facing on a regular basis. So I think that's, to me, a key difference. On the other side, I would say that the weaponry at the receiver position, like JSN, I love Doug Baldwin, Jermaine Kearse, Golden Tate. I love those guys. I have a very, very, very high opinion of how good Doug Baldwin was. I'm not sure any of those guys really compare to what JSN is doing. And I don't think it's just the offense that they're in. I think JSN is doing really, really special things. And he will be in the conversation for MVP potentially, which we'll talk about when we get to the next team, the next comparison. So point differential, that really separates this team. A couple of these other things. But it is worth noting that Seahawks team did not blow away the 2025 Seahawks team from a DVOA perspective through 7 games. So I thought that was interesting. Now we get to the 2005 Seahawks. That is, I think might be one of the better comparisons to this team. I didn't think that going in, but I think that now. I don't think it's perfect, but I think there's some similarities. And what I see there is, one, this team started off 5-2, just like the Seahawks. They ended up finishing 13-3. They won the division. They did get all the way to the Super Bowl, but they lost. And part of what I see is some similarities. One, I'll just start with where I ended the last one. JSN is having a Sean Alexander kind of year. Like, he just is. He is setting records. He's on the pace to set records. He is just unguardable. And that part of this offense seems like they have been hard to stop. Interestingly, that 2005 Seahawks team was built around that offense. And yet, this Seahawks team is averaging more points per game than that offense. This team's averaging 27.6. That one was averaging 25.9. But they were the number one DVOA offense at the time. The Seahawks are the 7th. So that's, I think, more accurately reflects how efficient that 2005 offense was. You also had Hall of Famers on your left side of your line, Walter Jones and Steve Hutchinson. I don't think you have any Hall of Famers on this offensive line. I don't think you can necessarily say at this point that there's any Hall of Famers at all on the offense. And as good of a season as Sean Alexander had that year to win the MVP, he was one of only 4 non-quarterbacks since the year 2000 to win an MVP. And only the 3rd since 2001. So it's been a lot of quarterbacks and a lot of, it's pretty rare what Sean Alexander did. To this day, I don't think he was the best player on that team. I don't even know if he was in the top 3. I think Walter Jones, Steve Hutchinson, clear Sean Alexander. I felt like Matt Hasselbeck was more valuable to the way that team operated than Sean Alexander. Now, that's blasphemy. I've gotten into very long debates with friends and others about that. But I thought Matt Hasselbeck was the clear leader of that team. I thought he is what made things go. He got them into the right offense. He was efficient in his passing, selfless in how he led. I just thought he was great. So it's a debate, at least. But all of the best players were on offense. Now, where there's another similarity between the 2005 squad and the 2025 squad is they had a draft that helped push them over the top. They drafted Marcus Tubbs, a defensive tackle who was a very big difference maker that first year, and Lofa Tatupu, who just was a huge game changer at linebacker. I think that this 2025 draft, I think you might look at Gray Zabel. You might look at Nick Emanwar. You might look at some of these, maybe Robbie Oots, who knows, as guys that really changed the ceiling for this team and the floor. So, Elijah Arroyo's in that mix as well. So I think that's another similarity between these two teams. And it's interesting. They started off in 2005 with a crushing loss, just like this team. But it was away. It was in Jacksonville. They lost 26-14. And they only started out 2-2. But then they won 11 straight games before they decided to rest starters in the final game of the season, and they lost to the Packers. The other thing that's really different between these teams is the NFC West was comically bad. It was so bad. It was historically bad that year. The 49ers were 4-12. The Cardinals were 5-11. The Rams were 6-10. No other team other than the Seahawks won more than 6 games. So they had pretty much a layup 6 victories within their own division. And the schedule also broke their way a little bit. Like, they did not have many tough games that year when they had a big contest against the Indianapolis Colts and Peyton Manning, who was the number 1 AFC team. Peyton Manning got hurt and Jim Sorgi had to come in at quarterback. So the Seahawks won that game without really having to beat Peyton Manning. And even their Super Bowl path was pretty easy. I mean, they got what was called the Redskins at the time. And then the Panthers were a team that like came up on the AFC side, beat some teams that nobody expected they would. That was a pretty easy NFC championship. Although I don't think anybody was going to win that game against Seattle in that stadium that day. It was unbelievable. And then they had the Steelers for the Super Bowl, which was a wild card team. Like they were the better team. No one can convince me otherwise. So they had a favorable schedule. Now we'll see if the Seahawks end up having a favorable schedule. The way things have fallen so far, it's looking like the Seahawks, the rest of their schedule is among the hardest, third or fourth hardest, depending on how you look at it, the rest of the way. So far, they've not necessarily had things break as easily as that 2005 squad. But hopefully you can see a little bit about why I thought that was a reasonable comparison for this Seahawks team. Now, one thing before I get off of that. Sorry. Let me bring it back. All right. So DVOA-wise, that team at this point was 4th overall. Again, this one's number 1. That was number 1 offense, but their defense was 16th and their special teams was 20th. So again, you had the a single unit that was dominant. This Seahawks team is much more complete so far than that one was. So just keep that in mind. All right. Oh, one other thing in that season, if you forgot, injury was also playing an issue. Ken Hamlin, their really talented safety, got into an incident off the field and missed the rest of that year. So they had to play a backup safety, Marquand Manuel, who was really good all the way through to the Super Bowl when he got hurt. And then Ettrick Pruitt came in and blew the whole thing. So that was not a deep team. When injuries started to creep in, especially in that Super Bowl, they were putting in really, really bad players. All right, last one. This is the 2003 Seahawks. They also started 5-2. They finished 10-6, second in the NFC West, and they did make the playoffs, but they lost in the wild card to the Packers in Green Bay. This was the famous, or if you think infamous, I think it's famous, moment when Matt Hasselbeck said, "We'll take the ball and we're going to score." Now, I think there's some similarities between this team and the 2025 team as well. The reason is all the rest of those teams were somewhat already established. Like they'd already had like the 2005 offense, the offensive line had been in place for a while, and the running game and Matt Hasselbeck and Mike Holmgren, like that all been there for a little while, been percolating. This Seahawks team is just like in its second season of kind of coming together. And I don't think the expectations were quite as high to enter the year. So that's where the 2003 squad's kind of an interesting one. And this was the year for me where they started to believe that they could be a Super Bowl team. And I thought Matt saying that in that game was evidence that they were starting to believe that they could be one of those types of teams. But if you look through 7 games, that Seahawks team was averaging 3 fewer points. They were allowing fewer points as well, which is interesting. Point differential, Seahawks, this one is much larger, 57-39. Yards per play, defensive yards per play, both better by this team. DVOA was better across the board, except for their offense was 5th in DVOA after 7 games versus this Seahawks team is 7th. So I kind of like part of the comparison there. Where it falls down for me is that team had a 33-year-old Chad Brown and a 36-year-old John Randall. They did have rookies in Marcus Trufant and Ken Hamlin, but, they ended up being like, they got as low as the 24th DVOA defense. They finished, I think, 18th. And I just don't know that this Seahawks offense is going to drop into the 20s in terms of DVOA. I kind of like, it's kind of a combination that 2005, 2003 as maybe the best comps. I'm curious what you guys think now that you've seen what I've shared. But I mean, when I looked back at this, basically the only team the only team that had a higher point differential after 7 games than this Seahawks team was the 2013 squad. That says something. Now, there were teams, I didn't go all the way back into the 80s. The 84, 86, and 87 teams all had better point differentials than this 2025 squad. So kudos to them. But for the last 25, 26 seasons, only 2013. And of the Super Bowl teams, only the 2013 team had a better point differential. Well, I shouldn't say 2014 might have, but other teams that started with at least 5 wins in their first 7 games, they had the best point differential. So that's notable to me. And I think there's a little bit from the 2020 squad about, is the passing game going to regress a little bit? Is the quarterback going to regress a little bit? There's some questions there where there's some similarity. Defensively, though, man, I think the 2013 squad is probably the best comparison. I'm not saying that they are as good, but I haven't found one that was better through 7 games that got off to this kind of start. So, and I would also say a difference is that this team has already endured some injury, which the 2013 squad, not as much on the defensive side, but they also endured some injury before everything kind of fell into place in the last part of that year for them to peak at the right time. You're going to be getting Devin Witherspoon and Julian Love and Derek Hall back after the bye. There's some reason to think this defense could actually get better than it has been to this point. And they're actually facing an easier schedule the rest of the way in terms of the offenses they're going to face. So I find this to be really interesting. I left this project feeling curious, I guess. I would want to say encouraged, and there is some of that. But there's so many differences between this team and some of those other teams. It was hard to draw a lot of lessons from those teams. And so I'm really interested. I'll go back and read some of your chats. I do see that there are some super chats. Let me get to those. Donna Burton is a new member. Welcome, Donna. Great to have you. Halo Hawk's been a member for a year. He says a JSN injury could kill the offense. Should we trade for a receiver? Yeah, JSN injury would be a huge issue for this offense. No doubt about it. The same way, look, Puka Nacua getting injured for the Rams is a big issue, but they were able to weather that. But yes, like, it would be a big deal. And do they trade for a wide receiver? I don't know. I mean, I don't know what they're going to do out of this bye week. Like, they could make a change at right guard. They could stick with it. They could add to the receiver room. They could decide we're not ready to push, like, to take snaps away from Cooper Kupp or Torrey Horton. Like, it's a challenging spot. I think the most likely might be that they just stand pat. I don't know. We'll just have to see on that one. Levitate Music says 2005 team is what made me a Seahawks fan. I saw them get screwed out of that game by the refs. Wanted them to win ever since. Go Hawks. I hear you. Well, hopefully you guys enjoyed that episode. I have got to head out. I'm going to be going to a Dustin Nickerson show with some family. So hope you enjoyed this show. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day. I will be back tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. with Griff Sturgeon as C-Mike Spin Move from the Seattle Overload podcast. We'll talk a little bit more with him about where he thinks this season's going. I will probably not be able to get the audio version of this pod up until I get home. We'll see how quickly I can move things around. All right. Take care, y'all. Have a good night.